He laughed as I packed my bags. That sound, half smug, half amused, filled the small living room like cigarette smoke that refused to fade. I kept folding my clothes in silence, one piece at a time, pretending that my hands didn't shake. Alan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. His lips curved in that familiar smirk that used to make me blush years ago, but now only made my stomach twist. "You'll come crawling back when the world eats you alive," he said. The zipper on my suitcase caught for a second. I forced it shut and lifted my eyes to him. "We'll see, Alan," he scoffed. "So what's the plan? You're going to live with the raccoons now? Out there in the wild?" He laughed again, louder this time, like it was the funniest thing he'd ever said. I didn't answer. Words felt pointless. Every argument we'd ever had circled back to this same cruel rhythm, him mocking, me enduring. So instead, I picked up the worn leather suitcase, the same one we'd used on our honeymoon in Charleston 12 years ago, and walked past him. His cologne, sharp and artificial, trailed after me as I stepped outside. The late afternoon air was cool, heavy with rain. For a brief second, I thought he might call after me, say something kind, something human. But all I heard was the door shutting behind me, hard and final. That was the sound of my old life ending. The driveway was empty except for my car, a faded silver Toyota that rattled when it idled. I loaded the suitcase into the trunk, sat behind the wheel, and stared at the steering wheel for what felt like hours. My hands were trembling, my chest tight. I wasn't sure if it was grief or relief. Maybe both. The divorce had been quick, clean, and cold. There hadn't been much to fight over. Alan had already made sure of that. The house, the savings, even the furniture, everything was in his name. I'd been too trusting, too naive to notice, and now all I had was what fit in the trunk of my car. He used to say things like, "Cara, you're just not ambitious enough," or "you wouldn't understand business." Every jab had chipped away at me until I barely recognized the woman in the mirror. When the court papers were signed, he didn't even look at me, just shook hands with his lawyer and left, as if I were a phase he'd finally outgrown. Now, sitting there in the silence of my own freedom, I realized something terrifying. There was no one left to tell me what to do. The rain started, soft at first. I watched the drops race each other down the windshield. I didn't cry, not yet. Instead, I reached for the glove compartment and pulled out a folded envelope, my only real piece of mail lately. It was addressed in careful, slanted handwriting, Ms. Cara Whitfield. Inside was a letter written on thick cream paper. "My dear Cara, if you are reading this, it means I've gone where peace finally lives. I'm leaving you the cabin, the land, and the memories that once healed me. Find yourself there. With love, Harriet, a cabin." I remembered Aunt Harriet vaguely, an eccentric woman who used to send me postcards from Maine when I was a child. She'd been my father's cousin, I think, or maybe a distant aunt by marriage. We'd only met a few times, but she always said, "You're different, Cara. You listen when the world talks." And now she was gone, leaving me a cabin in the middle of nowhere. I could almost hear Alan's laughter again in my head. "You're going to live with the raccoons now?" Maybe I would. Maybe that was better than living with a man who saw me as furniture. I started the engine, its cough echoing through the drizzle. My phone buzzed on the seat beside me, a message from Alan. I almost didn't look, but curiosity won. "Alan, don't forget to drop off the house key." Nothing more. No goodbye. No remorse. Just another order from a man who thought he owned everything, even me. I stared at the message for a long moment before deleting it. Then I threw the phone into the glove box and drove. The highway stretched endlessly, grey against grey, cutting through miles of mist and pine trees. Somewhere between the second and third hour, the anger began to fade, replaced by a strange, quiet calm. I rolled down the window and let the cold wind whip through my hair. It smelled like rain, mud, and the faint sweetness of pine resin. For the first time in years, I could breathe without holding my breath. At a gas station just past Portland, I stopped for coffee. The cashier, an older woman with kind eyes, looked at me and said, "Long drive, honey?" "Maybe the longest one of my life," I said. She smiled knowingly. "Then you're headed in the right direction." I don't know why, but her words hit something deep inside me, maybe because I wanted so badly for them to be true. As I got back into the car, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked tired, older than I remembered, but there was something else there too, a spark, the smallest flicker of defiance. By the time I crossed into Maine, the sky had cleared. The sun hung low, spilling gold over the treetops. The GPS said another 40 minutes to Harriet's property. 40 minutes until whatever came next. I didn't know if I'd find peace there, or loneliness, or just another version of myself I didn't yet understand. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back, not ever. There was a time when I believed Alan and I were meant to last forever. We met at a summer concert in Philadelphia, him with his easy smile and reckless confidence, me with a notebook full of half-finished poems I'd never let anyone read. He'd leaned in, asked if I wanted to dance, and I'd laughed because I couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at me like that, with curiosity, not expectation. For years, I clung to that version of him, the dreamer, the one who promised, "We'll build a life together, just you and me." And for a while, we did. We started small, a one-bedroom apartment above a bakery that always smelled like cinnamon and sugar. I worked as a part-time bookkeeper. Alan was a sales rep for a furniture company. We lived on cheap pasta and discount wine, but we were happy, or at least I thought we were. Then he got promoted. The raise came with a new car, a better apartment, and an ego that grew faster than our savings account. It started with small things. "You're still working part-time?" he'd say, frowning at my pay stub. "You could do better if you tried harder." Then came the comparisons. "Brian's wife just started her own business. Maybe you could take a few notes from her." Or the dismissals. "You wouldn't understand." This is real work, Cara. Each word was a drop of acid, subtle but steady. And I, like so many women raised to keep the peace, learned to swallow the burn. Years passed. The arguments turned into silence, and silence became our routine. When Alan lost his job, I thought it might bring us closer. I thought we'd finally be on the same side again. Instead, he collapsed inward. He refused to take jobs beneath his level, spent hours scrolling through listings, but applied to none. I picked up more shifts, worked weekends, balanced the bills while he watched sports on TV, and told anyone who asked that he was between opportunities. I remember one night, coming home late after an 11-hour day, I found him sitting in the dark, drinking beer, staring at the glow of the television. I'd said softly, "Did you eat?" He didn't answer, just shrugged. I wanted to scream, to tell him I was drowning, that I needed him to try. But instead, I took off my coat, reheated leftovers, and said, "It's okay. I'll handle it." That became my mantra. I'll handle it. The mortgage? I'll handle it. Groceries? I'll handle it. His moods, his pride, his silence? I'll handle it, until one day I realized I couldn't anymore. It happened at the grocery store. I was standing in line, holding a loaf of bread, calculating whether my last $20 would stretch until Friday. Behind me, a couple was laughing. The man said, "Honey, you always forget the milk," and the woman giggled, brushing his arm. I stared at them and felt something break inside me, not jealousy, but grief. Grief for the woman I used to be. The one who believed love meant partnership, not servitude. When I got home that evening, Alan was on the couch again. "Dinner?" he asked, without looking up. That was the moment I knew our marriage was already dead. I was just the last one who hadn't buried it. The divorce papers came 3 months later. I didn't fight. I didn't cry. I just signed my name where the lawyer pointed. Alan made sure everything stayed in his name, the house, the savings, even the car we'd bought together. My lawyer advised me to contest it, but I didn't have the strength for another battle. I just wanted out. He smirked when he left the courthouse, that same self-satisfied expression he wore the day he proposed. "You'll regret this," he said. "You can't survive without me." I believed him for a while. The first few weeks after the divorce were a blur of exhaustion. I rented a tiny studio apartment that smelled faintly of paint thinner, slept on a blow-up mattress, and ate canned soup. Some nights I'd wake up and reach across the bed before remembering. There was no one there. My mother called once, telling me I should try to make amends. I hung up halfway through her sentence. She'd never understood that some wounds don't heal, they just stop bleeding. Then one Tuesday morning, while sorting through the week's mail, I found a thick envelope with my name written in elegant cursive. It was from Maine. The letter was short, but the words carried weight. "My dear Cara, you were the only one who ever visited without wanting something. That's why I'm leaving you what I have. The cabin is old, but it's alive. So is the land. Find yourself there." There was a small map folded inside, drawn by hand, with a red X marking a spot near the edge of a lake. I stared at it for a long time. At first, I thought it was a cruel joke. I hadn't spoken to Aunt Harriet in nearly a decade. But as I reread the letter, something stirred in me, something I hadn't felt in years. Curiosity. That night, Alan called me for the first time since the divorce. His voice was full of false concern. "How's it going, Cara? You found a job yet?" "I'm fine," I said flatly. He chuckled. "Yeah, sure. You never were great at being alone." I almost told him about the letter, about Maine, about the cabin. But then I remembered his laughter the day I left. Instead, I said, "You're right, Alan. I was never great at being alone. But maybe it's time I learn." When I hung up, the room was quiet again. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of a cheap wall clock filled the air. For the first time, the silence didn't scare me. It felt like possibility, so I opened a new browser tab, typed directions to Lake Harriet, Maine, and whispered to myself, "Let's see where this goes." The highway stretched endlessly ahead of me, grey, cracked, and slick from the drizzle that had followed me since dawn. My old sedan hummed beneath me, its heater wheezing like an asthmatic old man, but it was doing its best. So was I. It had been 7 hours since I'd left Pennsylvania. 7 hours of silence, of watching pine trees thicken on both sides of the road until they swallowed everything else. I hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't turned on the radio. The only sound was the rhythmic slap of windshield wipers and the quiet thoughts that had followed me like ghosts. When the GPS finally announced, "You've arrived," I almost laughed. There was no driveway, no mailbox, just a narrow dirt path cutting through the trees. I hesitated, staring into the tunnel of green and fog before slowly turning the wheel. The road was uneven, more mud than gravel, and every turn felt like a test. My tires slipped twice before I caught sight of it. The cabin. It stood at the edge of a small clearing, framed by towering pines and the faint shimmer of a lake just beyond. The roof sagged on one side, moss climbing up its wooden ribs like ivy reclaiming what was once stolen. 2 steps creaked under my weight as I climbed onto the porch. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just stood there listening. Wind rustled through the trees. A woodpecker tapped somewhere in the distance. The air smelled of rain and pine sap. Clean, sharp, ancient. Then, almost without thinking, I whispered, "I'm here, Aunt Harriet." The door was unlocked. It swung open with a reluctant groan, sending a puff of dust into the air. Inside, the place was frozen in time. A rocking chair in the corner, draped with a faded quilt. A table covered in yellowed newspapers. Shelves of old books lined the walls, their spines cracked and curling. I stepped inside, my boots leaving small prints in the dust. It was colder than I expected. Not the kind of cold that bites, but the kind that lingers, the kind that remembers. In the kitchen, a kettle still sat on the stove, as if waiting for someone to come back and finish the tea. I ran my hand across the counter, the rough surface catching against my fingertips. The silence was thick, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt patient. I found the letter later that evening, tucked inside a small metal tin on the mantel. My name was written in careful script, Cara. If you're reading this, then I'm gone. This house has been in our family longer than you can imagine. It was never just a place, it was a reminder that life can be rebuilt one plank at a time. Don't sell it yet. Stay. Find yourself here. I sank into the old rocking chair, the letter trembling in my hands. The fire I'd lit crackled softly, filling the room with the faint scent of burning pine. For years, I'd lived in houses filled with noise, televisions blaring, doors slamming, arguments simmering beneath the surface. But this silence, it was different. It didn't judge. It didn't demand. It simply existed. That night I slept on the couch, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Rain started again, pattering gently against the windows, and for the first time in a long time, I slept without waking in panic. When dawn came, I woke to a strange kind of brightness, not loud or blinding, but soft, golden, and alive. The fog outside had lifted, and sunlight spilled through the trees like liquid honey. I opened the front door, barefoot, and stepped onto the porch. The air was crisp, the kind that fills your lungs and makes you remember you're still alive. The lake shimmered in the distance, perfectly still, reflecting the forest around it, and I thought, maybe this is what freedom sounds like. The hush of wind through pine needles, the gentle lap of water against the shore, the heartbeat of a world that doesn't need anyone's approval to exist. Later, I spent the day exploring. Behind the cabin was an old tool shed, half collapsed, filled with gardening tools, a rusted saw, and a stack of firewood that had turned silver with age. Inside the kitchen pantry, I found rows of glass jars filled with herbs and dried berries, each carefully labeled in Aunt Harriet's looping handwriting. Chamomile, sage, bay leaf, I smiled, imagining her living out here all those years, alone but not lonely. Maybe that was the point. Maybe she'd understood something I never had, that solitude wasn't punishment. It was space. Space to grow. In the late afternoon, I drove into the nearest town, a small cluster of wooden storefronts and weathered signs that looked like they hadn't changed since the 1950s. The general store clerk, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes, looked up as I approached. "You must be Harriet's niece," she said, before I could speak. I blinked. "How did you know?" She smiled softly. "You've got her eyes, and no one else drives up to that cabin unless they're lost, or meant to be there." We talked for a while, about the weather, about how Harriet used to bring pies into town every Sunday. Before I left, the woman handed me a small brown bag filled with bread, coffee, and a jar of honey. "Welcome home," she said. Those 2 words stayed with me the whole drive back. When I returned to the cabin, dusk was already falling. I lit the fireplace again, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat by the window. Fireflies blinked outside, flickering like tiny lanterns in the dark. I thought of Alan then, of how he'd once laughed when I packed my bags, told me I wouldn't last a week without him. I looked around the quiet cabin, the warm glow of firelight dancing on the walls, and smiled. He was wrong. I wasn't lost anymore. I was found. The first week in the cabin taught me one thing. Independence isn't as romantic as it looks in books. I had imagined quiet mornings with coffee on the porch, soft sunlight, and maybe a sense of peace. What I got instead were leaking pipes, a faulty heater, and a raccoon that treated my pantry like an all-you-can-eat buffet. The second morning, I woke to the sound of dripping, not rain, but the ceiling itself giving up. A small brown stain had spread above my bed overnight, and water was now dripping directly onto my pillow. I groaned, rolled over and whispered to no one, "Good morning." Freedom.
That day was a blur of frustration.
I learned that firewood doesn't chop itself, and that splitting logs is far harder than it looks on YouTube. My arms ached, my palms blistered, and when I finally managed to light a fire,
I realized I'd smoked out the entire cabin. By evening,
everything smelled like burnt pine and failure. Still, I refused to leave. Every bruise, every blister, it felt like proof that I was building something that was mine. On the 5th day, I drove into town for supplies. The same woman from the general store, Mary, smiled when she saw me. "Back for more coffee?" she teased. "More like back for a survival kit," I said, holding up a shopping list scrawled with desperate handwriting. Duct tape, nails, lighter fluid, canned soup. She laughed softly. "You'll get the hang of it." Harriet did too. Took her a while, but she found her rhythm. That made me pause. Did she ever regret staying here? Mary's eyes softened.
Not once.
She said the forest was the first place that listened when no one else would. The words stayed with me as I drove home. Halfway up the muddy road, my car hit a patch of slick dirt and sank deep into a rut. The tires spun uselessly. I cursed under my breath, trying reverse, forward, reverse again. Nothing. I got out, rain soaking through my jacket instantly, and stared at the situation.
That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Need a hand?
I turned to see a man about my age, tall, with rough hands and a kind smile that didn't reach for attention. His pickup truck idled behind mine. "Guess I do," I said, pushing wet hair from my face. "I'm Ethan," he said, already grabbing a tow chain from the back of his truck.
Let me guess, Harriet's niece? I blinked. How does everyone know that?
He chuckled. "Small town? Plus, no one else drives a city car up this road without getting stuck at least once. Together we freed my car within minutes."
Mud splattered up my jeans and I couldn't help laughing.
It had been so long since something went wrong and didn't end in despair, just laughter and rain. When I thanked him, he shrugged.
It's nothing.
"I do repairs around here. If the roof's leaking, I can take a look sometime." That was how it started. Over the next few weeks, Ethan showed up every few days, fixing a pipe, mending a step, patching the roof. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was never filler. He'd say things like, "Wood remembers how it was cut," or "Silence tells you what kind of day it is." It wasn't philosophy, it was just how he saw the world. And maybe that's what I needed. Someone who didn't ask about my past, didn't pity me, didn't try to fix me. Just someone who existed quietly beside me while I figured things out. We often worked in silence, the sound of hammering and wind filling the space between us. Sometimes, after he left, I'd sit by the window and realize the cabin was beginning to feel less like a burden and more like a companion. One rainy afternoon, while organizing the cellar, I found the box. It was hidden behind a stack of old crates,
half buried under dust and cobwebs.
Small, metal, rusted around the edges with a faint engraving on the lid, the initials HW. I hesitated before opening it. Inside there were folded papers, a few old photos, and a sealed envelope addressed to my Cara. I sat on the floor, my hands shaking slightly as I unfolded the letter.
If you've found this, it means you've chosen to stay, and that makes me happy.
This land is more than trees and dirt. Beneath it runs something powerful. Oil, maybe, or something else entirely. I never wanted to see it destroyed for greed, so I kept it quiet. But you, Cara, I trust you'll know what's worth keeping and what's worth letting go. There's a map enclosed.
Maybe one day you'll understand what this place truly holds. The letter trembled in my fingers.
I reached for the map, hand-drawn, yellowed, with a red X near the lake's edge, oil. Harriet had known, and she'd trusted me. That night,
as the rain whispered against the roof, I sat by the fireplace and stared into the flames.
My life had been stripped to nothing, and somehow, from that emptiness, something extraordinary had begun to grow. I didn't know what would come next. Maybe the oil meant money, maybe responsibility, But for the first time, I didn't feel afraid of what I didn't know. Outside, the forest was alive, the branches moving, the lake shimmering faintly under moonlight. I thought of Ethan's quiet smile, of Aunt Harriet's words, and of the woman I used to be, small, scared, apologizing for taking up space. She was gone now. In her place was someone new, someone learning, bruised but unbroken. And as the firelight danced on the cabin walls, I whispered to myself, I'm not surviving anymore.
I'm beginning.
When I first unfolded Harriet's map under the lamp, it felt like something sacred, a secret meant to be protected, not exploited. But the practical side of me, the woman who had once budgeted every grocery bill and clipped every coupon, couldn't help but wonder, what if this could change everything? I spent a few nights turning it over in my head before driving to the nearest law office in town. The man behind the desk, a grey-haired attorney named Mr. Wallace, adjusted his glasses and studied the old documents I'd brought. Miss Carter, he said finally, this deed grants you full mineral rights over the property.
That's quite rare.
Especially in this county. Mineral rights? I repeated, not fully grasping the weight of it. He smiled faintly.
In simple terms, if there's oil, gas, or any extractable resource beneath your land, it's yours. The words landed like thunder.
I thanked him, barely hearing the rest of his explanation. On the drive home, my hands trembled on the steering wheel. Beneath my quiet forest, there might be something worth millions. For days I didn't tell anyone, not even Ethan. The thought of drilling, of trucks and machines tearing through the soil that had become my sanctuary made my stomach twist. But curiosity has a way of finding its own path. A week later, a white SUV rolled up my dirt road.
A man in a pressed suit stepped out, his shoes sinking into the mud. Mrs. Carter?
He called. I'm Daniel Reeves from Northern Energy. We'd like to discuss a potential acquisition. He handed me a business card so polished it looked out of place against the rough bark of the pines. Inside, he laid out charts, satellite scans, projections, all with numbers that made my head spin. We'd be prepared to offer you $2.4 million for the rights, he said smoothly, and handle all environmental precautions. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. $2.4 million. I stared at the papers, hearing the echo of my old life. The arguments about bills, Mark's voice sneering about my little paycheck. But then I looked out the window, at the trees swaying in the wind, at the sunlight breaking through branches. I imagined heavy machinery replacing birdsong, and I knew this wasn't a decision I could rush. I'll think about it, I said quietly. Daniel smiled like he already knew the answer. Of course, people usually do. When he left, silence returned, heavier than before. That night I walked to the edge of the property where the forest opened into the lake. The water shimmered under the moonlight, calm and patient.
I whispered into the cold air. What would you have done, Aunt Harriet?
The wind rustled the pines as if the forest itself was reminding me. This land isn't just mine, it's part of me. 2 days later, I got my answer in the most unexpected way. I was cleaning the porch when I saw a familiar car pulling up the road, a black sedan I hadn't seen in over a year. Alan stepped out looking thinner, older, but his smirk hadn't changed. Well, he said, eyeing the cabin, you've
Upgraded. My pulse quickened.
What are you doing here? He shrugged, hands in pockets like always.
Heard about your little inheritance.
Word travels fast in small towns. So you came all this way to congratulate me?
I asked, folding my arms. He smiled, that same condescending smile I used to mistake for charm. I came because
Maybe we were both stupid. Things got messy, but maybe we could start over. I almost laughed. Start over?
You mean after you laughed while I packed my bags?
He looked down, feigning shame.
I was angry. You know how I get. But Cara,
I've been thinking a lot.
we had good years. And now that you're doing well, maybe we could... I cut him off.
You think I'm the same woman you left behind, don't you? He blinked. What's that supposed to mean? It means, I said slowly, you used to measure my worth by how much I could give you. Money, patience, comfort. You drained me dry and still told me it wasn't enough. Now that I finally have something of my own, suddenly you remember I exist. He stepped closer, lowering his voice.
Cara, come on!
You can't seriously think you're better off alone in the woods. Be realistic. I met his eyes, steady and calm. Realistic is learning how to fix your own roof. Realistic is chopping wood in the rain and realizing you don't need anyone to save you. His jaw tightened.
You sound crazy. Maybe, I said.
But at least I'm free, he scoffed, turning away. You'll regret this. You always do. I didn't stop him as he drove off. For the first time, watching his car disappear felt like watching a door close, not painfully, but with finality. Later that night, Ethan stopped by to return a tool he'd borrowed. He noticed the business card from Northern Energy on my table. You thinking of selling? He asked. I shook my head. No, I'll lease them the rights, but only part of it.
Enough to help the town, not destroy it, he smiled.
That sounds like something Harriet would have done. I hope so, I whispered, because this place saved me. I won't let anyone take that away. Outside, the night deepened, crickets singing, wind humming softly through the trees. The same land Alan once mocked had become the very ground I stood on to rebuild myself. Maybe Harriet had known all along. Maybe she saw in me what I couldn't see then, that sometimes the biggest fortune isn't buried underground, but found in the courage to stand your ground. And as I blew out the candle beside my bed, I murmured to the dark, I'm exactly where I belong. When Alan's car disappeared down the gravel road, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was peaceful. It was the kind of silence that hummed softly, like the sound of a door closing after a long, exhausting storm. I stood on the porch for a while, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The air smelled of pine and damp soil, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was standing on someone else's life. This was mine, messy, imperfect, but real. The next morning, I called Northern Energy and told them my decision.
I'll sell partial drilling rights, I said, my voice calm and sure.
But the rest of the land stays untouched. There was a long pause on the other end. That's highly unusual, Mrs. Carter. You're leaving millions on the table. I know, I replied. But I'm not interested in millions. I'm interested in peace. The man hesitated before saying, then peace? It is. The deal was finalized within a month. Enough money came in to repair the house, restore the barn, and secure a small trust for the future. But I refused to let the land become another scar on the earth. Ethan helped me negotiate everything, explaining legal jargon I didn't understand, and making sure I wasn't taken advantage of. When the paperwork was done, I asked him to stay for dinner. We ate stew by the fire, my cooking still simple but edible, and talked about ideas for what would come next. You could turn this place into a retreat, he said. A kind of escape for people who need what you found here. I looked at him, the firelight flickering across his kind, weathered face.
Harriet's Haven, I whispered. That's what she would have called it. He smiled.
And that's what it'll be. The weeks that followed were a blur of work and laughter. We built wooden cabins for guests, planted lavender and wildflowers along the path, and fixed the old sign out front with careful hands. The air smelled of cedar and sawdust, the scent of renewal. Sometimes when we took breaks, I'd catch Ethan watching me with quiet admiration. It wasn't romantic in the way movies show it. It was something steadier, deeper, built on shared effort and respect. One evening, as we stood by the fence watching the last rays of sunlight fade, he said softly, "You know, Cara, you're not the same woman I met months ago." I smiled.
No, I think she finally learned how to breathe, he nodded. And you make this place feel alive again. It was true.
The land had changed, not just physically but spiritually. Birds nested in the eaves again. Deer wandered close without fear. The garden flourished and laughter returned to the walls that once echoed with loneliness. But more than that, I had changed. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I stopped waiting for permission to rest, to dream, to exist on my own terms. I realized I didn't need anyone to validate my worth. Not a husband, not a title, not a paycheck. My value was already here, buried deep in the soil of my own resilience. Spring arrived early that year. The air was crisp and the first wildflowers began to bloom near the porch. On the morning Harriet's Haven officially opened, a small group of guests arrived. Artists, teachers, travelers, all seeking a quiet place to breathe. As I welcomed them, I caught a glimpse of myself reflected in the window. Hair messy from the wind, hands calloused from work, eyes bright. I barely recognized the woman who once trembled under Alan's disdain. That night, after the guests had settled, I sat on the steps of the cabin, a cup of tea warming my palms.
Ethan joined me, silent at first. "You did it," he said. "We did it," I corrected.
But more than that,
"I think I finally did something for myself," he nodded.
and for a while we just listened to the rustle of leaves, the whisper of the river, the laughter faintly drifting from the cabins. I remembered something Aunt Harriet wrote in her letter. Freedom doesn't arrive with a fortune. It arrives when you stop living like you owe the world an explanation. And now, sitting under the same stars that once looked down on her, I understood. I took a slow breath and said quietly,
"I'm exactly where I belong." Ethan looked at me, then out toward the horizon.
"You really are." The wind brushed against my face, cool and kind, carrying the scent of pine and soil, the smell of home. For years, I'd mistaken survival for living. I'd stayed in places that diminished me because I believed that endurance was strength. But standing here, surrounded by life, laughter, and light, I finally understood that true strength is knowing when to walk away and never looking back. When the last light faded, I closed my eyes, letting the quiet embrace me. The forest sang softly, and in that moment, I knew this peace wasn't fleeting. It was earned. Harriet's Haven wasn't just a place anymore. It was a promise that I would never again let anyone decide what I deserved, that I would keep choosing myself, again and again, no matter what. And with a smile, I whispered one last time into the night, "This isn't the life I dreamed of, but it's the one I built, and it's beautiful." It had been almost a year since I moved into the cabin, a full year of mornings wrapped in fog and pine, of nights filled with the soft hum of crickets instead of the noise of someone else's anger. Harriet's Haven had quietly become something more than I ever imagined. People came from across the state, tired teachers, single mothers, veterans, artists, all looking for something they couldn't name. And somehow, in the quiet of the woods, they found it. They called it healing.
I called it coming home. Every sunrise felt like a small miracle.
I'd walk the gravel path barefoot, coffee in hand, watching the mist lift from the trees. Sometimes Ethan would already be outside sanding wood or tending to the garden. We didn't always talk. We didn't need to. Peace doesn't demand conversation. One afternoon, as I was showing a guest how to plant lavender, I heard a familiar sound, the crunch of tires on gravel, heavier and slower than usual. A dark sedan stopped at the gate, and then I saw him, Alan. For a moment I couldn't move. He looked smaller. His hair had thinned, his shoulders slumped. He stood there holding a cheap bouquet of supermarket flowers, the kind that came wrapped in plastic and regret. "Cara," he said, his voice uncertain. "You look different." I wiped my hands on my jeans and stepped forward, keeping my tone even. "I am different," he swallowed hard.
"I heard about this place. Harriet's Haven, right?"
"You did all this?" "Yes." He looked around, taking in the cabins, the garden, the laughter drifting from the porch where guests were having tea.
I wanted to say I'm sorry," he stammered.
"For everything, for not seeing what I had."
I thought you needed me. I gave a small, calm smile.
You thought wrong. His eyes watered.
Can we at least talk? Maybe start over?
There was a time when that question would have shattered me, when I would have begged for it, for him to finally realize what he lost.
But not anymore. Alan, I said softly, you didn't lose me.
You gave me away. The day you laughed as I packed my bags, you made sure of that. He looked down, the silence between us stretching. I didn't mean it, he whispered. I know, I said, but the meaning doesn't undo the damage. You broke something that wasn't yours to break. I took the flowers from his trembling hands, not to accept them, but to ease the awkwardness, then gently placed them on the fence. These don't belong here, I said quietly, but thank you for the thought. He stood there for a few seconds, searching for words, then nodded, defeated. I hope you're happy, Cara, he said finally. I am, I answered simply, and with that he turned and walked back to his car. The engine started, hesitated, then faded down the road until there was nothing left but the sound of birds again. I didn't feel vindicated.
I didn't feel angry. I just felt light.
As if some invisible thread that tied me to the past had finally dissolved. Later that evening, I stood alone by the edge of the woods, watching the sunlight flicker through the pines. The wind carried the scent of lavender and cedar. Harriet's haven was alive, breathing. Ethan joined me, handing me a cup of tea. You okay? I nodded.
Yeah, he came by, I figured, he said.
You want to talk about it? No, I said with a soft smile. There's nothing left to say. We stood there for a long time, sipping tea, listening to the forest. The world felt quiet, balanced, like it was finally aligned with my heartbeat. After Ethan went inside, I stayed out a little longer, letting dusk wrap around me. I thought about all the years I'd spent shrinking myself to fit someone else's expectations. All the times I'd mistaken silence for weakness, compromise for love, endurance for strength. Now I knew better. Freedom, I realized, doesn't come with fireworks or applause. It comes quietly, in the stillness after a storm, in the calm after chaos, in the space where you finally stop apologizing for existing. I ran my hand along the bark of the old pine near the porch, the one Harriet had planted decades ago.
Thank you, I whispered. Not just to her, but to the woman I used to be, because she had survived long enough to become this version of me, or the one who finally understood that solitude isn't a punishment, it's
Peace. The forest rustled softly in response. As if agreeing, I looked up at the fading light. The sky painted in soft gold and blue, and said aloud, not to anyone in particular, but to the world itself, silence isn't loneliness, it's freedom. And somewhere between the whispering trees and the echo of my own voice, I heard it. The faint, beautiful sound of a life rebuilt. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady and real, and mine. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and soil, the smell of home. I closed my eyes and smiled. Freedom had a different sound now, and it was the most beautiful silence I had ever known.